inspired by kingdom principles that work for you.
Thank you for joining us at Forward, Upward, Onward Together as a part of RBNTV. My name is Carey and I'm your host. You may have found that in the past few years, it's gotten hotter. Because it has. Climate change is the crisis of our generation, and we're here to talk about climate change, hurricanes, and how we can build a more resilient society. And so we welcome Carlos Palacious. He has worked in Dubai, the Bahamas, USA, and Canada. He's worked on some of the most prestigious projects around the region and the world. And so we're so excited to speak with Carlos Palacious. He is the first Bahamian coastal engineer and has a wealth of experience. So please let's welcome Carlos Palacious.
Hey,
Carlos,
Carey.
Carlos, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
You know, you've gained a whole lot of expertise as the first Bahamian coastal engineer. And a lot has changed in the past few years as a result of climate change. But for those who may not know and may not be very familiar with the term, what is climate change?
Sure. So climate change is obviously a hot topic that has been hitting the media, especially with these hurricanes that we've seen in the last few years. You know, we're almost come to the point where every season we're getting a Category 5 storm that has major impacts and clearly disrupts our way of life, right? Our economy, our education, etc. I mean, outside of the pandemic, it's probably been the biggest thing that has had an impact on us in, let's say, the past 5 to 10 years. And so climate change really is the process by which the Earth refreshes itself, let's call it. There's a lot of debate on how much of that impact is due to humans versus nature. But basically, every few thousand years, there's an ice age. So the entire Earth freezes over. The last one we had was about 11 to 20,000 years ago. And so the Earth is going into another ice age, right? Humans have survived them before, and we will again, obviously, but the debate is often around how much impacts we have. We do know that greenhouse gases, et cetera, carbon monoxide, and the pollution from our cars and power plants has had an impact. We know that for sure. Our deforestation has had an impact, right? How much of an impact? It's always debated. But the reality of climate change is that the climate is continuously changing. And as a result, the weather systems, the weather patterns, et cetera, also change. And so we're seeing things like more frequent storms as a result of that.
Yeah, I've always had a problem with the term climate change. It seems too nice. It seems as if, a Sunday stroll. But in fact, it's actually catastrophic. We are warming the planet more than it has been in human history, and it's causing, and again, to your point, it's debatable to the extent of it, but again, it's contributed to the fires on the west coast of the United States, and it's also affected the strength, the porosity, and the wetness of hurricanes. Tell us about that.
Sure. So we know that the indicators that scientists can use to determine sort of trends, right? So one, for example, is taking samples out of the ice caps. They can see from samples of the ice caps the levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide, et cetera, in the air over centuries, right? Just by taking a core down into the ice caps. And we know, so that can go back thousands of years. And what they can do is they can then plot what those levels of CO2, et cetera, was, and they can know, was the Earth frozen over during this time, or was there air, right? Depending on the core. The same way, when you cut a tree, you can look at the rings and you can tell the condition of the tree, et cetera, right? Same type of scenario. So what we know is there's been a major spike, and obviously we've been recording these things over the last, let's say, few hundred years. There's been a major spike since the Industrial Revolution, right? When basically the world started to produce machinery, we got cars, we started heavy manufacturing, we essentially started to produce. And so we can see by plotting the impact of these gases over the years that as a result, for example, the temperatures of our waters and air have increased. We can also plot, and we have the plots of our water levels in terms of the ocean. So the sea level rise. is one of the impacts of climate change. And we have data from, several hundred years of what the sea levels were. And we can see where they're increasing faster now, where the amount of greenhouse gases have increased, and therefore the rate of climate change has also increased.
Yeah, you talked about the sea levels rising, and the Bahamas is a low-lying coastal archipelagic nation, and so that presents, just to put it as a challenge, just to put it mildly, we're a coastal community. We have several coastal communities around the nation, and so where have you seen climate change, or how have you seen that manifested already in some of our communities?
Sure, Carey. So, for example, at Guam and Caribbean Coastal Services, we've done a number of studies over the years, both locally and around the region. One that we finished in 2018, actually covered 6 Caribbean countries, basically looking at the impacts of climate change, what laws that they have in place, what studies and departments and resources they have in response to how we can better improve. Right. Another one that we looked at was the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Policy Framework for the Bahamas. So the long and short of what that means is basically looking at locally, what are our laws, what are our standards, where are we, and what can we look forward to in the future, and how do we need to adapt, which is the big word, to these changing environments. And so the take home of all of that we've seen from the data collection, the studies, et cetera, is one, we're in the top 10 in the world in terms of potential impact of climate change, top 10. So that's not a list you want to be on, right? There are significant projected impacts, especially to our major tourist areas, right? Because as you can imagine, they're near the water, right? Low-lying, etc. The average elevation in the Bahamas is somewhere between 3 and 5 feet above sea level. So just think about that. The average elevation of our entire country is between 3 and 5 feet above sea level. Right, so just looking at the projected sea level rise over the next century, which is projected to be somewhere around 3 or so feet, we can expect confidently we're going to have major impacts, right? So therefore, we need to now add resiliency into our planning. We need to add zoning and certain types of restrictive or improved building standards into our codes. So we have to be proactive, because if we're reactive, then we'll get caught with our pants down. That's the long and short of it.
Yeah, Carlos, you talked about how we can adapt and how we can be more resilient. And that's a striking figure. 3 to 5 feet is our elevation, extremely low-lying nation. And to be at to be so vulnerable is definitely concerning. As you started out, we said that this is the crisis of our generation. So how do we be more proactive, and how do we change and adapt and provide a little bit more resilience to climate change?
There's the national policy level, and certain steps have been made. For example, the Disaster Recovery Authority was created in response to Dorian. Mandatory evacuation policies were created, right? We're currently in the process as a country of mapping many of our areas so that we can have hazard maps, right? So then we can know how vulnerable certain communities are. So where do you have to, where is mandatory evacuation required? Under what scenario? And then where can people be relocated to, for example, if they're impacted by a major storm, right? We know certain communities get impacted regularly. And right now there's no incentives, and there needs to be tax breaks, land swaps, et cetera, to help to incentivize people to, okay, you've been in this community for several hundred years, but here's an opportunity, if you're concerned, to rebuild in a higher part of your island, right? And people often ask the question, well, should we just abandon certain islands and move to higher ones? And I don't think it's that simple. I mean, my family is from Inagua and from Acklands, right? And even though Acklands only has 200 people, I mean, there's memories there, it's a part of our community, but we can definitely empower our people and be more intentional with encouraging persons, as well as guiding people on how to be better prepared for these storms. Have an emergency plan for your family. Make sure that you don't just have your hurricane supplies, but they're actually in a waterproof bag, for example. So if you had to leave, you grab the bag. Nobody has time to go in the cupboard, right? If your family or you can't swim, you have life vests, right? If you were to have flooding in your home. So all of these types of things that we have to create it as a part of our culture. And we have many cultural traditions, but we need to add in this realization of what climate change will bring into our DNA as Bahamians.
Yeah, as you said, that we have this cultural fixation to our land. You know, your father's family is from Acklands and Inagua, and so that there's this cultural connection to the land as well. And it sounds like you bring a very unique perspective, perhaps as opposed to having and living on a very vulnerable piece of the coast. Perhaps that there's somewhere that's elevated, that's a bit more protected. And I would imagine that there's also some things that we can also do to protect the coast as well, such as sea walls and elevated bridges. I know that there have been some elevated bridges been built in recently or rebuilt in Grand Bahama. But we build our industry and our tourist product, and as I said, we have an amazing connection to our specific land, and there's so many memories there as well. What more can we do to protect the coast in particular? Do we need to build on stilts, or do we need to enhance our seawalls?
Yeah, so Carey, the challenge is understanding that we as humans want to fix things, right? So we determine that this is my property boundary. Yeah, I have this lovely beach, but my property stake is here, and therefore that's my property, right? We build a road, and we don't want the road to wash out. We want the road to sit there, right? Forever, for example. But Mother Nature isn't like that. If you look at beaches and mangroves, et cetera, like habitats shift, right? And so Mother Nature is a dynamic scenario, but humans want to make things static. We want to say that this is the conveyance on the land I have, and this is where the beach is, so the beach should always be there, but that's not how it works, right? And so we have to start building with nature, understanding that by protecting the environment then protects us. Like a lot of the coastal structures that you mentioned, whether it's like breakwaters or groins, the rocks you see out in the water by Saunders Beach, let's say, or the rocks in the water off from Bahamas, another project that we worked on, they are built to mimic coral reefs or built to mimic headlands, which are nature's way of helping to provide storm protection. I mean, obviously, they provide, for example, coral reefs have fish and other types of habitat and things we enjoy, but a major advantage of them is to protect the land, right? So when we remove coral reef, when we remove mangroves, for example, which happened in a lot of areas where we infill it, we say it's just swamp, we fill it in, we put grass, we allow people to develop on it. And then when these storms come, the storm surge comes, Mother Nature's natural resiliency is gone. And so we have to respond by putting in man-made structures. So obviously, as an engineer, a part of my job and our firm's job is to strike the balance, right? I mean, you have to have infrastructure. You have to have a seaport, right? If in your islands to be able to have food, right? You have to have certain basic level of infrastructure. But at the same time, we have to strike the balance. And we have to understand the impact we're having and determine the cost-benefit analysis, not only from an economic standpoint of jobs, but also from an environmental standpoint to make sure we're being good.
You also touched on the economic impact of climate change and building resiliency. Building new roads and bridges is a huge economic impact. I would also imagine that not doing anything and being reactive as opposed to proactive is also equally as or worse in terms of our economic impact. And so, what is the economic impact of climate change and building additional resiliency?
Hundreds of millions to billions of dollars in the aftermath of these major storms. And so studies have been done that basically show the largest contributors actually to our forward-facing expenses will be climate change and climate-related impacts, right? And we like to think about hurricanes, right? And they're more of the extreme event, but even just these major rain events that we get, right? We have what we call nuisance events. Several times a year, we have a lot of rain, downtown Nassau floods, right? Which is a major issue for store owners and tourists, et cetera. Many of our communities, right? A lot of very well-known communities have major flooding. And just that alone has impacts on furniture. It has impacts on insurance claims. It has impacts on just the standard of quality of life. And so with that projected to increase, there's a clear indicator that we have to be proactive in terms of how we respond to that.
Yes, and just building additional infrastructure and fixing our homes and seawalls, all that adds so much more to the government. We started our discussion talking about climate change, and there's something that we can do to blunt the effects of climate change. But what can we do to blunt actual climate change, to stop the Earth from warming? We know that I read somewhere that we are now producing more carbon dioxide than we really ever have. But I think that there's still some work that we can do to blunt or reverse global warming. What are your thoughts?
There are different studies that pushes to, move towards solar, for example, right? To try to reforest some areas that have been removed, to try to protect certain areas, let's say in the Amazon, et cetera, where a lot of our carbon dioxide is absorbed, and then, as you know, plants produce oxygen, which is regenerative. So a part of it is there's a few steps, but even at home. So we often hear the argument that, well, the Bahamas doesn't really produce anything. We're a small country, but we're the ones who have to deal with the consequences. And I say, yes, that's true. But we are contributors, right? In this type of global climate, we want to buy clothes for, cheap. We want to buy goods and services cheap. And the problem is the producers of these goods for us to consume are honestly the major contributors, but we are all the consumers. So if we are intentional with making sure that the refrigerants, for example, that we're bringing in for our fridges or our air conditioners are meeting proper environmental codes and not just buying the cheapest one, that our cars and that we put in place proper protocols to make sure that even though we only have 300 and something thousand people, that our cars are properly meeting the best standards. And we're not just allowing, anything to come in because it's the best price. And of course we know, and there's a striking balance, right? These are very tough economic times. At the same time, we have to be aware, right? And we have to be conscious that we are all contributing to this, not just the big countries.
You're right. All of us play a role in making sure that we can reverse some of the effects of global warming and climate change. But the truth is that we produce a fraction of 1% of carbon dioxide and add to the global warming. But we are really ground zero of the climate change crisis. And so I just say that to say is that we all have to do our part around the world to live more sustainably and to live really more environmentally consciously.
Just for example, helping to do beach cleanups is helping your environment, right? Helping to go out and plant trees, which the National Trust and many organizations do, is helping your environment, right? Coastal Awareness Month, where they go out and try to replant sand dunes, is helping your environment, right? When you go to the beach, taking your litter and not throwing it on the ground or allowing it to go into the water, is helping. Right? Making sure, once again, your muffler is properly installed. Very simple, small steps that if each of us took on the responsibility, would globally have a positive effect.
Yeah. So that's what we can do as private citizens. And you talked about what government has done to help in terms of hurricanes and making sure that we have evacuation plans in place. But what government policies can help to reverse climate change?
When we first began was the fact that Mother Nature is taking us into the next ice age anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not so much that we can stop that from happening, but it's more so that we don't have to be the accelerant, right? If we don't have to pour the gasoline on the fire to make it happen faster, right? Which is currently what we're doing. So being intentional, like I said, with putting in place proper standards and protocols, and the Bahamas Bureau of Standards has been trying to bring in place more international restrictions and requirements, like I said, on what type of products we can bring in, what types of things can be disposed of in our country, right? Because we actually take a lot of waste in from a variety of different sources, right? Even sources foreign to our country. Waste is put in our landfill, for example, right? So making sure that we are at least following best international practices, right? And from let's say a land use planning, making sure that the communities where we're going to build or rebuild are either at acceptable elevations or standards, or in the cases where they aren't, let's say, or concerns, then the infrastructure, et cetera, the access to healthcare, the access to emergency response is in place.
We started our discussion talking about hurricanes, and we know that we have really seen the devastating effect of hurricanes in recent times. There's Dorian and the Abacos and in Grand Bahama, and Hurricane Maria recently, and we've seen devastation from Ragged Island. And I'm sure this is something that you've studied quite a bit, how have you seen that a lot of these communities have really built back, and are we doing it in a really resilient way?
Yeah, the challenge with building on the island, and like I said, I mean, I've been to over 50 islands and keys of the Bahamas, and our firm has done studies after every major storm in the past decade, right? And the reality of it is it's tough building on the islands, right? And it's also expensive. And unlike, let's say, Nassau and Grand Bahama and maybe Abaco and the Exumas, where oftentimes you can get a mortgage, therefore, they force you to have your building permits in place, force you to have homeowners and replacement insurance, right? When you're building in the island, you're building out of pocket a lot of times, right? You're fishing, farming, you're in tourism, and so you add a room on here, you add a room on there. So by the end of it, a lot of it is non-compliant with the code, right? That's the reality of it. Now, there are challenges where we also need to improve our codes, right? Which is a separate conversation, as well as we need to retrofit our homes. Let's remember, like if you were to build right now to the current code, right? In 5 or 10 years, your building is now outdated, right? If you live in a house, for example, right now that is 10 to 15 years old, your current house, even though it might have been built to the code then, does not even meet the present code, right? And then we have storms like the Dorians that exceed those codes. So you can see how it's a challenge, right? And so, like, if we were to take the major points that we see in terms of the damage, right? By far, most of the damage comes from water. And you see the devastating flooding, storm surge, etc., right? A lot of damage comes from houses that would have had small repairs done, for example, or let's say you have some shingles that flew off before and you never fixed it. As a result, the plywood got wet. So now when a hurricane comes, that part of the roof is the first part to fail. People who have hurricane impact windows, which is something I always talk about. Remember, a hurricane starts at 74 miles an hour. So you think you have hurricane impact windows, but when in reality, the windows you bought out of China were only rated to a category 1, but you don't back down thinking you're safe. And from these storms, they intensify quickly. And yes, it might be a Cat 1, and then 24 hours later, it's a Cat 3, right? And now you didn't batten down and you weren't prepared. So windows blow in, etc., because people feel I have hurricane impact windows. Those types of scenarios, and then elevation. Reality is a lot of our homes are built lower, as well as we're a low-lying country. Can we all just pack up and move on top of hills? No, but that is a fact. So a lot of low-lying homes lead to a lot of flooding.
So as we close, we're in the thick of hurricane season right now. What advice do you have to homeowners and Bahamian and Caribbean residents now?
Sure. We have to think of our home and think of preparing for hurricanes the same way we think of other aspects of our life. We're not doctors. You nor I are doctors, but you feel a little pain inside. You might take a Tylenol. All right, it still didn't go away. At a certain point, you say, listen, I need to go to the doctor. Something's wrong, right? And it's the same way with our homes. Like, you don't have to be a professional architect or engineer or contractor, but at a certain point, you see that leak on your ceiling, you see the shingles have blown off. You don't have to be a contractor or an engineer to know that, hey, a few shingles blew off. Maybe I need to get someone to look at it, right? That type of thing. My door doesn't fully close, right? I always slam it. It doesn't fully lock. Now, when a storm comes, you're more vulnerable. So I always say that do little checkups on your home. The same way you do a little checkup on your body, you go to a doctor anyway once a year just to do a checkup. And that doesn't need to be every year. Every 5 years or so, or after a major event, just do a little checkup. And if for example, you live in a home and during one of these big rain events, your house floods, or during a previous hurricane, your house floods, then don't stay there during a storm. You know, it's best to pack up your home, take your most valuable things, and go stay by somebody who, you know, has sort of stood the test of time, who might not have those challenges. Because ultimately, you know, that it's about life, it's about safety. So listen to and be aware of what the Met Office and the first responders, et cetera, are saying. Be cautious and be intentional, because you know our lives really depend on it, and our future as a country, as families and communities depend on us being proactive and being diligent.
Carlos, a very fascinating discussion on climate change, hurricanes, and how we can be more resilient. Love what you said, that we have to be intentional about the way that we live. Gone are the days when we could just stay down and hunker down and hide in the hurricanes and just. We have to be very intentional about what we do, how we build our houses, how we retrofit, and really how we live more intentionally and sustainably. That'll be the big difference. As we said, how we can blunt the crisis of our generation is really going to be up to us to fix it. And so again, Carlos, I thank you so much for joining us at Forward, Upward, Onward Together. If anyone in our viewing audience wanted to contact you, where could they reach you?
Sure, I'm on media, of course. Feel free to check me out on Carlos E. Palacious on Facebook or on LinkedIn, and shoot me a message if you have any questions. It'll be my pleasure to pass on any resources or information that I can.
Terrific. Carlos, thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching Forward, Upward, Onward Together. Like our page, share, and subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
You're watching RBNTV. We are networking, promoting, we're scoring points for you, proclaiming, declaring, here to encourage you. No matter the problem, we will enlighten you. We hear you, please listen, there is a point.